A lake can be a source of healthful fun activities and serene relaxation. But like any living system, a lake can get sick. And its decline often happens so gradually, so quietly, that we don't notice until it's too late. The process, surreptitious process, is called eutrophication. It's the story of how a healthy lake slowly dies. It doesn't start with a dramatic event. It begins with small, almost invisible changes. The water might lose a bit of its sparkle, the lake might feel a little less vibrant. But beneath the surface, a fundamental imbalance is taking hold, one that will eventually lead to yucky, mucky sediment, a loss of oxygen, explosive algae blooms, and a complete unraveling of the lake's ecosystem. The story of this decline starts with two key nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, a lake needs these nutrients to survive, just like a garden needs fertilizer. But the problem begins with too much of a good thing. These excess nutrients flow into the lake from the world around it. They seep in from leaky septic systems, wash off of fertilized lawns and farm fields, and pour in from stormwater drains. They even get released from the lake's own bottom sediments. A little bit is fine, but when the dose becomes a deluge, it triggers the decline. When the amount of nutrients entering a lake exceeds what it can naturally process, they don't just wash away. Lakes flush out very slowly, so these nutrients begin to accumulate, building up year after year. The water becomes richer and richer, creating the perfect conditions for something to take advantage of it. And the first to respond is algae. This nutrient enrichment leads to a stage called overproduction. It's a rapid, explosive increase in the growth of algae and aquatic plants. The algae, floating in the warm, sunlit surface layer, have an all-you-can-eat buffet. They multiply at a staggering rate, turning the water from clear to a murky green. As the algae population explodes, the water's clarity plummets. This cloudy, turbid water is often the first visible sign that the lake is in trouble. Sunlight can no longer penetrate deep into the water, and the native plants living on the lake bed begin to starve for light. The entire underwater landscape starts to change. The clear, vibrant world is being replaced by a thick, green soup. But these algae blooms are fleeting. They are a boom and bust cycle. Once the algae consume all available nutrients, or as the seasons change, the bloom dies off. Billions of dead algae cells then begin to sink, drifting down through the water column and settling on the bottom. And this is where the next, more sinister stage of the lake's decline begins, deep in the dark water. As this thick blanket of dead organic material accumulates on the lakebed, an army of decomposers, mostly bacteria, goes to work breaking it down. But this process of decomposition requires oxygen, and with so much material to break down, the decomposers consume a massive amount of it. More and more dead algae sinks, and more oxygen is used up. In time, the deep layer of the lake becomes what's called hypoxic, a place with extremely low or even zero oxygen. In this suffocating environment, the deep water ecosystem completely collapses. Fish that need the cold, deep water to survive either flee or die. Tiny animals called zooplankton, a critical part of the food web, disappear. The organisms living in the sediment, the foundation of the deep water community, die off. The bottom of the lake becomes a dead zone. And here, in this low oxygen environment, the lake enters its most dangerous phase. The chemical conditions of the sediment change. Under healthy, oxygen-rich conditions, the sediment safely locks away phosphorus and nitrogen. But in a low oxygen environment, that lock is broken. The phosphorus and nitrogen stored for decades in the lake's bottom are released back into the water. This process is called internal loading, and it creates a devastating, self-sustaining feedback loop. The released nutrients from the sediment fuel a new algae bloom at the surface. That bloom dies and sinks, consuming more oxygen. The lower oxygen levels then trigger the release of even more nutrients from the sediment. This is the moment the lake starts poisoning itself. It means a lake can continue its decline even if all the external sources of pollution, the runoff, the fertilizer, are completely cut off. The engine of its own destruction is now running from within. This is the downward spiral of eutrophication. It's a chain reaction that accelerates over time. Nutrients increase, algae overproduce, water clarity declines, dead algae sink, oxygen decreases, and the sediments release even more nutrients, starting the cycle all over again, but worse this time. As these conditions worsen, the very nature of the algae community changes. The system shifts to favor the hardiest, most aggressive species. Cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, thrive in these nutrient-rich, low-oxygen conditions. They grow fast, they form thick, smelly blooms, and critically, many of them produce toxins. The lake has now become home to harmful algal blooms, a direct threat to wildlife and human health. The consequences ripple through the entire system. Water clarity is gone. The food web has collapsed. The annual cycle becomes predictable. Each year, the blooms return sooner and last longer. Left unchecked, the lake becomes completely dominated by toxic cyanobacteria and its own internal nutrient recycling. It is a shadow of its former self, less resilient, unstable, and caught in a cycle that steadily pushes it further into decline. In the end, the complex story of a lake's death can be broken down into 4 key steps. First, a nutrient overload from the world outside. Second, the overproduction of algae that feast on those nutrients. Third, the loss of clarity, and more importantly, the loss of oxygen in the deep. And finally, the beginning of internal nutrient recycling, the feedback loop that locks the lake into a state of decline. Together, these 4 acts form a tragedy, a self-reinforcing cycle that is incredibly difficult to break.
We have seen how general algae blooms start the decline. But not all green growth is the same. In Lesson 4, Algae, Good versus Evil, we'll look at the microscopic difference between the good guys that feed the food web in the lake and the toxic bacteria that take over when eutrophication wins and starves and poisons the food web. To go to the next lesson, use the link below and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.